Hi. This video is about understanding the father's brain. And in understanding our own brains, we're also going to understand the brains of our children. And in doing so, we're going to understand what strategies we might be able to use to ground ourselves physiologically, as well as what to expect and how to support our children. Now, this isn't going to be a science lecture. We're not going to get too deep into the weeds, but we are going to talk about three basic structures and two systems that are present within our bodies, how they impact us, and how we can work to regulate them. The first structure within the brain that we're going to talk about is the hindbrain, or what we would sometimes talk about as the reptilian or lizard brain. And I reach back here because this is in the back of our brain stem coming up, and then we have our larger cortex over top. If we think about it developmentally or evolutionarily, this hindbrain then continued to evolve new and more advanced brain functions on top. Much more complex structures, but it doesn't mean that our hindbrain or our reptilian brain isn't important and plays a vital role to our functioning. This part of our brain back here regulates our autonomic processes, our breath, our digestion, our heartbeat, all these things that we don't want to think about. They just happen automatically day in and day out. This is really the essence of survival. That my ancestors, as did yours, did whatever they could to survive. They would eat anything, destroy anything, just to perpetuate the species. Our hindbrain can regulate all those things that we don't want to have to think about. And there are times when our hindbrain kicks into gear. We get hijacked maybe because of sleep deficits or hunger or stress or threats to our well-being, that then this kicks in. Right? And that's the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And that can happen both in ourselves and in our children. And so we want to be thoughtful about those times that our hindbrain kicks into gear and how that can lead to a sense of dysregulation. But so too for our children, that crying is a survival mechanism. For children, they are living in that hindbrain. They are survival machines. They are signaling their needs, they're asking for their needs to be met, they're groping, they're grabbing, and then as children grow, we see that continuing to be present. They are doing things to actively survive. And there might be times where our toddler or our child gets hijacked with their hindbrain, and we need to help them understand that process and help them meet their needs so that they can regulate that process. Now, as I talked about, we can think about the brain developing evolutionarily. We've got our hind reptilian brain, and then over top, and this is pretty broad strokes here, but we've had this cortex. So this is the higher order, kind of more developed or evolutionarily advanced processes. So within that, we have these two hemispheres, the right and the left. And if you look at a picture of a brain, you'll see these two structures up top with the corpus callosum in between, which essentially helps that communication between these two sides. That right hemisphere is more emotional or creative, and this tends to be a little more dominant in early childhood. This comes online after the lizard brain, but before the thinking brain. But for us as adults, as fathers, this hemisphere is already online. It helps us process tone in speech, understand and interpret body language, as well as interpret our own emotions and start to see those emotions in other people. This is wonderfully rich and helpful information to have. However, it can be disconnected from a narrative or logic because it doesn't involve the left hemisphere. Essentially, we're just having experiences. Because of that, our right hemisphere tends to create implicit memories, where we store these feelings, these emotions in response to events, but we store them without words. So we don't have the sense making to it, we just know that we feel upset. And so as adults, we might remember things from our childhood where they're just emotional tones, or we might experience a threat to our well-being, and we don't remember a lot about what was happening, but we remember how it felt in our body. And we can get a pretty clear picture of how that might show up for our kids then, is that they experience this emotional flooding without any sort of understanding, right? Think about a child becoming dysregulated, like upset that something's going on, and they have a hard time calming down because they don't have the ability to story with their left hemisphere. That hasn't fully developed yet. And so as fathers, we might see that our child's being dysregulated and we need to work to co-regulate through our presence, through our tone of voice, and that sense of calm. And you'll notice that the tone of voice, that sense of calm, are ways that we're communicating to their right hemisphere. Now the other hemisphere, the left hemisphere, is more logical and verbal, and it comes online later in our development. So we're not going to see this in a toddler. This helps us develop that linear, story-based thinking. So this happened, then this happened, and this is why it happened. And it's that sense making that can help us understand the environment, the experiences that we're having, and how those emotions connect meaningfully. And this ability to logically narrate experiences develops explicit memories. This is where we recall events, we can understand our emotions, and we can understand what happened and why. And because children don't have a well-developed left hemisphere, it can be hard to reason with them, which probably seems pretty intuitive. But for example, a toddler wants to take their stuffed animal to the table when they're having a messy meal. And as a parent, we know, gosh, that's going to make the stuffed animal messy. They're not going to be able to take it to bed with them, and that's going to be a bigger problem later on. And so we take the stuffed animal away. Now, they don't understand the logical reasoning for doing that. They don't understand when they're going to get it back. It feels really far away and unimaginable. But they also don't understand that we can't wash the stuffed animal every day. And so we see how that neural development, essentially that brain development, can impact their well-being and how they understand and experience events. So too, as fathers, we can see how this left hemisphere can help us make sense of events. So a child becomes dysregulated and upset, and we might find that our right hemisphere and our hindbrain, so our hindbrain gets activated, we feel this threat. Our right hemisphere is responding to it and interpreting those emotions. If we, with our left hemisphere, can narrate and make sense of that experience, then we can create a more cohesive response to that, instead of becoming dysregulated ourselves. And you can see how these systems start to work together. That adults rely on the left hemisphere quite a bit, but under stress, that goes offline. That irritability, that numbness suggests that the hindbrain is in the dominant position and is driving the car. And this becomes important for us to talk about here because it acknowledges that we are not failing. We don't have some sort of character defect or behavioral malfunction. Instead, we're acknowledging that our system is overwhelmed and our left hemisphere is going offline. And recognizing this hijacking is the first step towards reclaiming our agency. That if we know this left hemisphere isn't working the way we need it to, then we can take steps to rectify that, rather than shaming ourselves for not being enough. And this starts to get us into the nervous system, of which there are two aspects I want to focus on. The fight response versus the rest response, or the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is essentially our stress mode, and it gets activated by a sense of threat. And that could be an actual threat outside of us or a perceived threat. So the threat emerges, and as a response, cortisol floods our system. That's the stress hormone. Blood leaves our brain, right when we need it most. It leaves our gut, and it goes to our large muscle groups. And so that's why we can sometimes feel agitated or really tense. It's because our body is prepared for action in some capacity. But because my muscles have this blood and my brain doesn't, it means my thinking becomes impaired. Those most important higher cognitive processes that are going to be able to work through this situation are now offline. I've become hijacked by my nervous system. And the perceived threat can even come from our family. It doesn't discriminate. Noticing that activation in our body, though, helps us understand how to respond and how to contextualize what we're experiencing. The antidote to our sympathetic nervous system response is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that rest and digest or calm mode. This is when blood starts to return to our gut, to our brain, and all of a sudden we're able to think again, and our presence is restored. This is important because now we can effectively use our left hemisphere to logically work through and narrate the experience that we're having. And if we're able to catch our stress response, that fight, flight, or freeze response, we can then actively cue to shift our system to that rest and digest response. And we can use a couple of different tools to re-engage with this calm. These are pretty simple activities that we can do that you might already engage in, and the more that we practice them, the easier or more accessible they become. The first is breath work. 3 to 5 minutes of slow breaths is enough to cue our parasympathetic nervous system. However, even 3 deep breaths is sufficient to start to calm our system. Movement can be very effective. Going for a walk, stretching, doing some Tai Chi or yoga. And it doesn't need to be a long, drawn-out activity. It can be enough just to go online and YouTube or something and just look up 5-minute yoga, and that can be enough. We can gauge memories about feeling different ways. Over a century ago, Alfred Adler called this the push-button technique, and it surprisingly works. If I think about joyful moments, loving moments, caring moments, fun moments, that starts to shift my emotional response inside, and it starts to shift me physiologically. Finally, some simple grounding techniques. One of my favorites is to just put my hand on my chest. That tends to calm me significantly. You can even hear it in my voice. Putting my feet on the ground and even thinking about my feet being in my shoes right now, how that feels. It shifts my awareness and it starts to ground me and slow me physiologically. These type of small activities can go, again, a long way to cueing our parasympathetic nervous system. So in review, yes, our biology, our brains, and our nervous system can hijack us, but knowing about this can help give us some options, both for ourselves and knowledge about the options that are available to working with our kids and understanding where they are developmentally. These small actions that we can take based upon this awareness can bring us back to ourselves, ground us in who we want to be, and help us show up more effectively for our children. As fathers, understanding these internal systems helps us stay calm, conscious, and connected with our families. As we move through other concepts, we'll see that we'll revisit these structures and these physiological responses. We'll find that there are different ways that we might work with them or talk about them. Each one is true and kind of accurate from a different perspective, but it starts to expand our understanding of this internal space. And so I encourage you to keep this in mind as we move through these different modules. Thanks.